presentation, I'll be evaluating two multimedia assets for articulatory phonetics. The first asset is a diagram which comes from an introductory textbook to linguistics. It shows the human vocal tract. The second diagram is a video that was put out by the University of British Columbia to teach students about articulatory phonetics. The target audience for both of these assets would be linguistic students in an introductory course. These students are likely to be English-speaking, college-aged, and have little to no pre-existing knowledge of phonetics or the vocal tract. In other words, this is instruction targeted at beginner learners who are discovering these concepts for the first time. The first asset I'll be looking at then is the diagram of the human vocal tract. From the perspective of the design principles, it does and does not meet best practices. The major problem becomes evident when we think about the contiguity principle. If we look at the position of the labels and the parts of the body they're pointing to, they're not close enough to each other. This example of the soft palate, which is found back there, is ideal. Instead of being back here behind it, which would make more sense, it's all the way up here. However, it does a much better job of upholding the coherence and pre-training principles. In terms of coherence, it only indicates the parts of the human vocal tract that are involved in producing English sounds. So for instance, you don't have the uvula being indicated here. As a whole, it also meets the pre-training and segmenting principles. It introduces the students to the parts of the vocal tract before, later in the chapter, the authors are going to talk about how they're used in producing sounds. In terms of learner appropriateness, it has certain pros and cons. On the positive side, the anatomy is really simplified for beginners, as I've already discussed. It focuses on the parts that are relevant to the production of English speech. In addition, it uses simple everyday terms rather than complicated anatomical ones, which makes it more readily understandable. On the downside, the representation is somewhat unclear. The diagram isn't immediately recognizable as a representation of the human vocal tract. In particular, the depiction of the nose and the tongue are really unclear. The labeling is also confusing, as I've mentioned, with arrows crisscrossing each other and labels far away from the points they actually identify. Lastly, in terms of ease of use and access and cost, this diagram is found in a textbook, which happens to cost around $170. That's really expensive for a textbook. Looking at the diagram itself, on the page on which it appears, it's small but reasonably clear. In particular, it's set off by a nice amount of white space, which makes it significantly easier to read. However, it would still be inaccessible to blind or visually impaired learners who'd have no way of accessing that information. So, if I had to make particular recommendations for improving this image, I'd suggest that the illustrator came up with a more accurate outline of the face that was easily identifiable. I'd also suggest they increase the size of the image, which would allow them to move the labels closer to their relevant parts and also make it more accessible to visually impaired learners. In addition, I feel as if this diagram could increase its pre-training potential by focusing on all the points of articulation. For instance, it doesn't have the lips or the teeth mentioned, and they're both really important in terms of how speech is produced. Moving on to my second asset, the video from the University of British Columbia. It also meets and doesn't meet various design principles. Starting with the principle of coherence, the video provides a lot of information at one time. So it's primarily interested in teaching students about place of articulation and defining places such as the palatal. The animation is useful for illustrating this particular position, but it also provides IPA, which is extra information the students haven't learned yet, and that will increase cognitive load. Likewise, it has a few moments where it provides superfluous flourishes, like this little speech bubble or this thought bubble saying, "let's work together," which does nothing but distract students from the content of the diagram. In addition, it also tends to have animations. Text moves across from the left or fades in and out, which again is distracting and serves no real purpose. Moving on to the redundancy principle, the video in general does a good job with it. It tends to provide just animation and narration. In places where it does provide text in order to emphasize points, it tends to be brief and focused. Likewise, it does a good job of meeting the contiguity principle. If we compare this diagram with the one earlier, it's evident that labels are much closer to the parts they indicate, which makes it easier to see what belongs with what. In addition, it does a good job of meeting the modality principle. Most of the information is given in the narration rather than in a lot of extra text. Nonetheless, the video could benefit from more segmenting and pre-training. In particular, as I've already mentioned, it talks about the IPA symbols at the same time as it's introducing manner of articulation and the vocabulary that goes along with it. It would make much more sense to introduce IPA later. Finally, it meets the embodiment principle by having one of UBC's linguists on the screen. However, it doesn't really meet the personalization principle as he talks very formally. In terms of its learner appropriateness, it's generally good. It provides full coverage of the basics, it gives very clear explanations and illustrates them with good animations, and it invites students to take part in interactive demonstrations using their own vocal anatomy. On the downside, as I've already discussed, it presents too much new information and will probably cause cognitive overload. In terms of ease of use, access, and cost, it's a free resource on YouTube, but it's generally high quality. It has excellent animations, and it includes accurate subtitles that make use of YouTube's subtitle feature. Blind users would obviously be able to access some information, but it does provide good verbal explanations and cues. If I had to make any recommendations, it would be to segment information so that the IPA is introduced later or even in a separate video. I would also ask them to rework the script so that it's less formal and stiff, and most importantly, I'd have them cut out the unnecessary transition animation.